A German tank crew was celebrating after destroying 5 American tanks in one day. They painted kill marks on their barrel and laughed about how easy it was. Then they heard a sound that made their blood run cold. December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front. Hitler threw everything he had at the Americans, including his most feared weapon, the Tiger tank. These monsters had been destroying Allied armor for years. American tank crews were terrified of them. A single Tiger could take out an entire platoon before anyone could get close enough to fight back. German crews felt invincible. They had superior armor, superior guns, superior training. And then something showed up that would shatter that confidence in less than 5 minutes. Let me paint you a picture of what American tank crews were dealing with in 1944. The standard American tank was the M4 Sherman. Good tank, reliable, easy to repair. But it had one massive problem: it couldn't kill a Tiger from the front at normal combat ranges. The Tiger tank was a monster, officially called the Panzerkampfwagen VI Tiger Aus. But everyone just called it the Tiger. This thing weighed 54 tons. Its frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick. That's almost 4 inches of hardened steel. The gun was an 88mm cannon that could punch through American tank armor from over a mile away. Meanwhile, the Sherman weighed 30 tons and had frontal armor that was maybe 2 inches thick in most places. Its main gun was a 75 that couldn't penetrate Tiger armor from the front unless you were basically touching it. And getting that close to a Tiger meant you were already dead. American tank crews had a saying: it takes 5 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger. The first 4 die so the 5th can get a shot at the side or rear. That wasn't a joke. That was actual tactical doctrine. You'd send tanks to die as a distraction so one could flank and get a shot at the weaker side armor. The psychological impact was devastating. American crews would spot a Tiger and just freeze. Some would bail out of their tanks immediately rather than face it. Others would fire every round they had at it, watching their shells bounce off the armor, then sit there waiting to die. Tank commanders were reporting that their crews were on the edge of breaking mentally. There are after-action reports from American units that are just brutal to read. One Sherman platoon encountered 2 Tigers near Aachen in October 1944. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. All 5 Shermans were destroyed. The Tigers took 0 damage. 14 American tankers died. The Tigers drove away without a scratch. Another report from France described a single Tiger holding up an entire American armored column for 3 hours. It was positioned at a crossroads and just picked off any tank that tried to advance. Knocked out 9 Shermans before it finally withdrew when it started running low on ammunition. The American commander wrote in his report, "Our tanks are coffins. The men know it. I know it. We advance because we're ordered to, but we all know we're driving to our deaths." The problem went beyond just armor and guns. German tank crews were often veterans with years of experience. They'd been fighting since 1939 or 1940. They knew their tanks inside and out. They knew tactics. They knew how to position themselves to maximize their advantages. American tank crews, on the other hand, were mostly new. The U.S. had ramped up tank production so fast that they were pumping out thousands of Shermans, but the crews to operate them were green. Some had only been in Europe for a few weeks. They were facing an enemy that had been perfecting tank warfare for 5 years. The training disparity was huge. German crews drilled constantly on gunnery, on tactics, on coordinating with infantry and other tanks. American crews got basic training and were shipped out. They learned on the job if they survived long enough to learn anything. And the Germans had another advantage: they were defending. They knew the terrain. They could choose their positions. They'd set up ambushes at choke points where American tanks had to advance through narrow roads or open fields with no cover. The Tigers would be hull down behind hills or buildings, only their turrets visible, making them even harder to hit while they picked off American tanks one by one. By December 1944, the situation was getting desperate. The Allies were advancing toward Germany, but the cost was getting higher every day. Tank losses were mounting. Crews were refusing to get back in tanks after watching their friends burn to death inside knocked-out Shermans. Morale was cratering. American commanders were screaming at their superiors for better tanks. The British had developed the Firefly, a Sherman variant with a better gun that could actually hurt German heavy tanks. But there weren't enough Fireflies to go around, and American units rarely got them. The US was working on new tank designs, but they wouldn't be ready until 1945 at the earliest. Meanwhile, Hitler was planning one last massive offensive. He'd been hoarding men and equipment for months. His plan was to punch through the American lines in the Ardennes forest, race to Antwerp, cut off the Allied supply lines, and force a negotiated peace. It was desperate and probably impossible, but Hitler was past caring about realistic strategy. The offensive would include over 400 German tanks, including dozens of Tigers and the even more powerful King Tigers. These would spearhead the assault, smashing through American positions and creating chaos in the rear areas. Hitler was betting everything on this attack. If it failed, Germany would be finished. The Ardennes was chosen specifically because it was lightly defended. The Americans considered it quiet sector. The forest was dense, the roads were poor, and everyone assumed the Germans wouldn't attack there because the terrain was so bad for tanks, which made it perfect for a surprise attack. December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The German artillery opened up across a 75-mile front, thousands of guns firing simultaneously. The bombardment was so intense that American soldiers couldn't hear themselves think. Then the tanks came. German armor poured through the forest, overwhelming thinly spread American units. Communication lines were cut. Units were isolated and destroyed. The front line collapsed in multiple places. Within hours, the Germans had penetrated miles into American territory. American tank units rushed to respond, but they were scattered and disorganized. Individual Sherman platoons found themselves facing entire German armored columns. The results were predictable. American tanks were being knocked out faster than headquarters could keep track of losses. One American tank company encountered a Tiger battalion on the second day of the offensive. The Americans had 12 Shermans. The Germans had 8 Tigers. The engagement was one-sided slaughter. All 12 Shermans were destroyed in less than 20 minutes. The Tigers suffered one damaged track from a lucky shot that still didn't penetrate the armor. The German tank crews were confident. They'd been destroying American armor for years. The Tigers in particular felt invincible. Their armor had never been penetrated from the front by a Sherman. They'd been told the Americans had no weapon that could threaten them. And for the first few days of the offensive, that seemed absolutely true. One Tiger crew in particular was having a spectacular run. Commander Otto Carius and his crew had knocked out 5 American tanks on December 18th alone. They painted 5 white rings on their gun barrel to mark the kills. They were joking about how easy it was. American tanks would appear. They'd fire once or twice. The Sherman would brew up, that's tank crew slang for catching fire, and they'd move on to the next target. Carius wrote in his diary that night, "The American tanks are no match for us. They try to fight, but it is like children playing at war against professionals. Today we destroyed 5 without taking a single hit in return. I almost feel sorry for them. Almost." Other German crews were reporting similar experiences. The Tigers were dominating every engagement. American tanks were dying in droves. The offensive was going well. The Germans were ahead of schedule. Victory seemed possible. But the Americans were rushing reinforcements to the area. Infantry divisions, artillery units, and tank battalions were being pulled from quiet sectors and thrown into the battle. Among these reinforcements was something the Germans hadn't encountered before, something that would change everything. The M26 Pershing heavy tank had been in development since 1942, but production had been delayed repeatedly. The U.S. military establishment didn't think they needed a heavy tank. The Sherman was fine, they said. It was reliable and easy to produce. Why spend time and money on something new? But reports from the front lines had been increasingly desperate. Tank crews were begging for something that could fight German heavy tanks on equal terms. Finally, in late 1944, a small number of Pershings were shipped to Europe for field testing. The Pershing was everything the Sherman wasn't. It weighed 46 tons, almost as heavy as a Tiger. Its frontal armor was 4 inches thick, comparable to German heavy tanks, and critically, its main gun was a 9-beam cannon that could penetrate Tiger armor from the front at combat ranges. Only about 20 Pershings made it to Europe before the Battle of the Bulge started. They were distributed to various units for evaluation. Most were still being unloaded from ships when the German offensive began. But a handful were already in theater, assigned to units near the Ardennes. The crews selected to operate the Pershings were experienced Sherman veterans. These weren't green recruits. These were guys who'd been fighting for months, who'd survived multiple engagements, who knew what they were doing. They were given minimal training on the new tank, basically just enough to drive it and shoot it, and then sent to the front. Staff Sergeant Clarence Smoyer was one of these crews. He'd been driving Shermans since Normandy. He'd fought through France and into Belgium. He'd seen friends die in knocked-out tanks. He'd faced Tigers before and survived only through luck and the sacrifice of other tanks in his unit. When he was assigned to a Pershing, he couldn't believe it. "We took one look at that tank and knew everything had changed," Smoyer said in an interview decades later. "It was bigger, heavier, tougher. The gun was massive compared to what we'd been using. For the first time since we'd landed in Europe, we felt like we had a chance." Smoyer's Pershing was designated Eagle 7 and assigned to the 3rd Armored Division. They were rushed to the Ardennes to help stop the German breakthrough. The crew had maybe 6 hours of training on the new tank before they were in combat. They didn't even have time to properly zero the gun. The crew consisted of 5 men, Smoyer as driver, Gunner Clarence "Smokey" Davis, Loader John DeRiggy, Bow Gunner Homer Davis, and Tank Commander Bob Early. None of them had ever fired the 9-beam gun in combat. They'd shot maybe a dozen practice rounds. That was it. They rolled toward the front on December 22nd. The weather was terrible. Snow, fog, freezing temperatures. Visibility was maybe 100 yards on a good day. The roads were clogged with refugees, retreating American units and supply columns trying to move forward. It was chaos. Intelligence briefings were sparse. German forces were everywhere. Tiger tanks had been reported in multiple locations. American lines were fluid, meaning nobody knew exactly where the front was. The crew of Eagle 7 was told to move forward until they found the enemy, then engage and destroy. They linked up with an infantry company that was trying to hold a small town called Elsenborn. The infantry had been getting hammered by German armor. They'd lost contact with neighboring units. They were low on ammunition and anti-tank weapons. When they saw the Pershing roll up, the infantry started cheering. One soldier ran up to Smoyer and asked what kind of tank it was. Smoyer told him it was a Pershing. The soldier had never heard of it. "Can it kill a Tiger?" he asked. Smoyer shrugged. "Guess we're about to find out." The infantry commander briefed Early on the situation. German tanks had been spotted moving through the forest about a mile to the east, probably Tigers based on the sound of their engines and the size glimpsed through the trees. They were advancing slowly, carefully, using the terrain. An infantry patrol had tried to stop them with bazookas but got chewed up by supporting German infantry. Early studied his map and found a position that would give them a good field of fire across an open area the German tanks would have to cross. He moved Eagle 7 into position behind a stone wall at the edge of the town. From there, They had a clear view across maybe 300 yards of snow-covered field to the tree line where the German tanks would emerge. Then they waited. The crew was tense. They'd all faced German armor before, but this felt different. They had a tank that might actually be able to fight back. But might was the key word. Nobody knew for sure. The Pershing was untested. The gun was new. If it didn't work, they were dead. Smokey Davis sat in the gunner's seat, eye pressed to the sight, scanning the tree line. His hands were on the turret controls, ready to traverse and engage the moment a target appeared. Der Riggy had a 9mm round already loaded. Homer Davis was on the bow machine gun. Smoyer had his hands on the driving controls, ready to reverse them out of the position if things went bad. Early stood in the commander's hatch. Binoculars up, watching. The sound came first. That deep, rumbling engine noise that every tank crew in Europe had learned to recognize. The distinctive sound of a Maybach engine, the power plant used in German heavy tanks. Multiple engines. At least 2 tanks, maybe more. Then they saw movement in the tree line. A massive shape pushing through the forest. The unmistakable profile of a Tiger tank. 54 tons of German steel emerging from the trees onto the open field. Behind it, a second Tiger. The lead Tiger stopped at the edge of the woods. Its turret traversed slowly, scanning the town. The commander was probably glassing the area with binoculars, looking for threats. They'd done this 100 times before. Find American positions, destroy them from range, advance. The routine that had worked since 1942. Early made the call. Target Tiger tank 300 yards. Gunner, fire when ready. Davis centered the sight on the lead Tiger. His hand moved to the firing trigger. Every instinct from months of combat in Shermans was screaming at him to shoot the tracks, shoot the side, get out of there before the Tiger saw them. But they had a 9mm gun now. They could shoot center mass. They could aim for a kill. He took a breath, steadied his aim. The Tiger was still stationary, presenting a perfect target. He squeezed the trigger. The 9mm gun fired with a crack that was louder and sharper than any Sherman gun. The recoil rocked the entire tank. A tracer streak shot across the field. Time seemed to slow down as the crew watched the round fly toward the Tiger. It hit the Tiger's frontal armor just below the turret ring. For a split second, nothing happened. Then sparks flew. The round penetrated, went through 100 millimeters of hardened steel like it was paper. Inside the Tiger, the German crew experienced every tank crew's nightmare. The penetrating round came through the front armor at supersonic speed, turning into superheated metal fragments that ricocheted around the crew compartment. The loader and gunner died instantly. The commander lost his left arm. The driver was blinded by metal fragments. The radio operator was screaming. But to the Americans watching, they just saw the Tiger shudder from the impact. Smoke started pouring out of the hatches. Then flames. The surviving crew members biled out, the commander falling out of his hatch because he only had one arm to climb with. The second Tiger had been following about 50 yards behind the first. Its crew saw what happened and reacted instantly. The driver threw the tank into reverse while the turret traversed toward the American position. They'd identified the threat. They were taking evasive action and preparing to return fire. But Davis was already traversing to track the second Tiger. Der Riggy had loaded another 9mm round. Early called the adjustment. Second target, moving, lead him. Davis tracked the revering Tiger. It was backing into the tree line, looking for cover. He aimed for the center of mass and fired again. This shot hit the Tiger on the front glacis plate at an angle. The round still went through, penetrated the armor, killed the driver, severed the fuel line. The Tiger rolled backward another few feet, then stopped. Smoke poured out. Seconds later, it exploded as the fuel ignited. The turret lifted off the hull and crashed down beside the burning wreck. The entire engagement lasted maybe 45 seconds. 2 Tigers destroyed. 0 damage to the Pershing. The crew sat in stunned silence for a moment. They'd just done something that was supposed to be impossible. Early broke the silence. Did we just kill 2 tigers? His voice was shaking slightly. Yeah, Davis said. Yeah, we did. The infantry that had been watching erupted in cheers. Soldiers were running toward Eagle 7, jumping and shouting. Some were crying. These guys had been getting massacred by German armor for days. They'd watched Tigers destroy American tanks like it was target practice. And now they'd just seen a Tiger die. 2 Tigers, killed by 1 American tank in less than a minute. Word spread through American units with incredible speed. A new American tank had shown up and it could kill Tigers from the front. Crews that had been on the verge of breaking suddenly had hope. Infantry units that had been falling back started holding their ground. The psychological impact was massive. For the German tank crews, the effect was the opposite. For years, they'd been told their Tigers were invincible against American armor. Their frontal armor couldn't be penetrated. They could engage and destroy American tanks from ranges where the Americans couldn't fight back. This was gospel. This was fact. And now that fact was dead. 2 Tigers had been destroyed from the front at medium range by an American tank. If it could happen once, it could happen again. Suddenly, every engagement carried real risk. They weren't invincible anymore. Otto Carius, the Tiger commander who'd been celebrating his 5 kills the day before, encountered a Pershing 2 days later near Bastogne. His crew spotted the American tank at about 400 yards. Carius ordered his gunner to fire. The shot was good, hit the Pershing's frontal armor. The round bounced off. We hit him square and nothing happened, Carius wrote in his diary that night. My gunner insisted the range was good, the aim was perfect. The round should have penetrated, but it just bounced off like we'd hit another Tiger. The American tank returned fire and we had to withdraw. I have never felt fear like that before. Always we have been the hammer. Today we were the anvil. Other German commanders were reporting similar experiences. Pershings were showing up across the Ardennes. There weren't many of them. Maybe a dozen actually saw combat during the Battle of the Bulge, but they were having an outsized impact. German tanks that had been advancing aggressively were now moving cautiously, afraid of running into these new American tanks. The tactical dynamic had shifted. German tank commanders could no longer just roll forward and engage American armor with confidence. They had to identify what kind of tank they were facing before committing to an engagement. Was it a Sherman they could destroy easily, or was it a Pershing that could kill them? This hesitation was fatal in fast-moving combat. Armored warfare is about speed and aggression. Hesitation gets you killed. German units that had been making rapid advances started slowing down, becoming more cautious. This gave American forces time to regroup and reinforce. The Battle of the Bulge continued for several more weeks, but the German offensive had lost its momentum. American forces stopped the breakthrough and began pushing back. The Pershings, despite their small numbers, had played a role in this by breaking the myth of Tiger invincibility. One engagement in particular became famous. A Pershing commanded by Lieutenant John Grimball encountered 3 Tigers near the town of Houffalize on January 12, 1945. The German tanks were positioned to ambush American forces advancing down a road. They destroyed 2 Shermans already when Grimball's Pershing came around a bend. The lead Tiger fired first, hit the Pershing's turret, but didn't penetrate. Grimball's gunner returned fire while the driver was reveering back around the bend. The 9-beam round went through the Tiger's frontal armor and set off the ammunition. The tank exploded, turret flying 30 feet into the air. The second Tiger adjusted its aim and fired. Another hit on the Pershing's turret, still no penetration. Grimball's gunner fired again, killed the second Tiger. The third Tiger decided discretion was the better part of valor and withdrew at high speed. Grimball radioed back to headquarters. Engaged 3 Tigers, destroyed 2. Third withdrew. Took 2 hits, 0 penetrations. This tank is a war winner. That phrase, war winner, started getting used by other Pershing crews. They felt like they'd finally been given a weapon that let them fight on equal terms. Morale among American armored units shot up. Crews volunteered to transfer to units that were getting Pershings. Tank commanders who'd been writing letters home assuming they'd die started believing they might actually survive the war. The Germans tried to counter this new threat. They brought up more Tigers and even some King Tigers, which were even more heavily armored and armed. But the King Tigers were slow, mechanically unreliable, and consumed fuel at an insane rate. In the retreating, chaotic German army of early 1945, keeping them supplied and operational was nearly impossible. Meanwhile, more Pershings were arriving in Europe. Production had ramped up once reports came back about their effectiveness. By February 1945, over 100 Pershings were in theater. By the end of the war in May, nearly 300 were in Europe. The Pershing didn't win the war by itself. The war was already effectively won by the time it arrived in significant numbers, but it changed the nature of armored combat on the Western Front in the final months of the war. American tank crews went from feeling like victims to feeling like they had a fighting chance. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For the Americans, the Pershing restored confidence and morale at a critical moment. For the Germans, it shattered the myth that had sustained their armored forces through years of fighting, the myth that German tanks were superior and unbeatable. Otto Carius survived the war. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote about the Pershing. When we first heard reports of these new American tanks, we dismissed them as propaganda. The Americans had never produced a tank that could challenge us. But when I faced one in combat, I understood immediately that the war had changed. We were no longer the hunters. We had become the hunted. The Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945 with a complete American victory. The German offensive had failed. Their last reserves of men and equipment were spent. The road to Berlin was open. Clarence Smoyer, the driver of Eagle 7, survived the war. His Pershing destroyed 6 German tanks during the final months of fighting. After the war, he returned to Pennsylvania and rarely talked about his experiences. When asked about the Pershing decades later, he said, "That tank saved my life, saved a lot of lives. We went from being outgunned and outmatched to being able to fight back. That's the difference between dying and going home." The lesson from this story isn't just about tanks or weapons. It's about the danger of assumptions in combat. The Germans assumed their technological superiority was permanent. They assumed the Americans couldn't or wouldn't develop better tanks. They assumed their Tigers would remain invincible. Those assumptions cost them. When the Pershing appeared, it didn't just destroy German tanks. It destroyed German confidence and the psychological advantage they'd held for years. The crews who'd been laughing about how easy it was to kill American tanks suddenly found themselves on the receiving end. In war, the moment you assume you're unbeatable is the moment you've already lost. The Germans learned that lesson the hard way in the frozen forests of the Ardennes in December 1944. Subscribe for more untold war stories that changed history.